How exactly do Omnists see God? I mean, on a practical level. By the way, guys, I do apologize. I've had a flu lately, so my voice may be a little funny, but I'm recording anyway. I had a friend of mine ask me some questions lately, and I thought they were really interesting questions. They were things that I hadn't necessarily thought about in many years. I think that once you cross a certain line, you sometimes forget about some of the practical aspects. And so it's really great when someone asks me a question like that, and it sort of brings me back to those things. In this case, it was, do I see a monotheistic God or a polytheistic God? I mean, ultimately, how do I really see God in my mind? And as an omnist, and keep in mind, when I say as an omnist, I'm really speaking of myself, only myself. I doubt that there's any other omnist out there that believes exactly like me. There might be a few, but I'm speaking very generally in this case. This is how I tend to see things, and I only mention these things in the hopes that in seeing them that way, maybe it will get you thinking along certain lines. Not to tell you this is how you should believe in God. Um, but he was basically saying, do you believe that there's actual polytheistic gods running around, or there used to be polytheistic gods running around, uh, or do you believe ultimately in a monotheistic God that everything is just an emanation of? And of course I said, well, I'm somewhere in the middle. And he said, well, what do you mean in the middle? And I thought, well, that's a good question. After all, omnists can always say we're in the middle, but what do we really mean by that? In my case, what I started realizing many, many years ago when I was just thinking about God, just thinking about God and what God was, literally, and God got bigger and bigger and bigger in my mind the more I thought about the concept. And simply speaking, for me, I don't necessarily believe in a monotheistic God or a polytheistic God or even a polytheistic God. I think that God is probably whatever he, she, or it actually is probably beyond all of those concepts. To me, monotheism and polytheism and pantheism and animism and all of those things are our perceptions. They are our way of seeing God. Because to some extent, I mean, we all experience God. Any of us that exist experience God. We experience God simply by existing. We experience everything that was created in whatever way it was created. We experience that. So it's not that I don't think we can know God. It's more that I think we can't completely know God. In fact, I think in order to completely know God, you would probably have to be God, which one could say we are in a way, or we are a part of God. There's so many different ways of phrasing that. But let me give you a few examples. Let's say, for instance, that the entire world was a forest, or let's just say that we were raised in a forest. You know, many years ago, when we couldn't really travel outside that forest, or we never traveled far outside that forest. We didn't go to other lands. For us, the entire world was the forest. We would see God as the creator of a forest. We would see God as someone who loves trees and loves this and loves that, and that is how we would see God. We would see God as the creator of this particular environment. Now, these days we see the world as a whole, and so we say, oh, this is God. God is one who creates this kind of a civilization, of a people, who creates all these species, who creates this planet, who creates this type of an existence. But imagine for a moment, well, yes, but it's also the God who creates a universe. And this is where, for me, God gets big. Because while at one point, I think that you could very easily look at God as something a little more limited. Let's say, just a monotheistic God, the old guy who actually came down and formed us out of clay and created this, and that's fine. That is one way of looking at God, but to me that does kind of make God, a smaller version of God. Because when you start looking at the God who created the universe, and you say, oh, this is the kind of God who creates planets, who creates solar systems, who creates dark matter and dark energy and quantum physics and all of the causality that we have in this universe. That is another way of looking at God. Now imagine you decided to see God as the one who created all the universes, all the multiverses, and everything that we can't experience, everything that we don't know anything about. Well, now you're talking about a God who is completely outside of our envisioning, because we don't know what all those other worlds are. We don't know what is outside our world. We don't even know what's in our world. I've talked about this in other videos before, but we only experience our world in a certain way, from a certain perspective, from the senses that we've been given. And so that is the extent of our knowledge. Imagine for a moment that all of life was a book, literally a book. This is one of my favorite analogies, is to compare life to a book. And a character in this book is trying to figure out who wrote the book. And so eventually he comes to realize, okay, there must have been a writer. There must have been someone who wrote this book. And so they postulate about the writer of this book. And they think, okay, well, obviously this is a writer who likes to write, I don't know, fantasy. Maybe this book is very much a fantasy world. And so this is obviously the type of book this writer likes to write. Or let's say more literally, it is precisely our world, and therefore this writer is a realist, or what we would call a realist. Obviously, in another world where anything you could possibly imagine was happening, that wouldn't actually be fantasy. Even if you had wizards and elves and dragons running around all the time, that wouldn't actually be a fantasy, because there it would be real. But we postulate, okay, that is who this writer is. He is a writer of what we consider reality. Well, if we got to know a little more about that writer, if we actually got to understand something beyond the book, we might find out this writer writes all kinds of books. No, he's not a writer of realism. Sometimes he's a writer of what we call realism, but in reality, he's just a writer of what he writes. He writes a fantasy, he writes a science fiction novel, he writes a horror novel, he writes all kinds of different books. But still, we have a writer. We have a person that we can look at and say, okay, that's the guy who wrote all of reality. Then someone comes to understand a little more about the publishing industry. And they say, well, yeah, we were written by this guy, but we were also kind of written by the editor. And the editor actually made a lot of major contributions. He said, I think we should do this instead of that. He made a lot of suggestions. What about the publisher? What about the book cover? The person who made the book. Now, instead of looking at a monotheistic writer, we have a polytheistic concept. Oddly enough, as it expands, it becomes polytheistic, because you realize that all these different people actually contributed to this book. So how do you look at God now? How do you look at the writer now? My point being that it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more confusing. And this is why, to me, omnists have to be very elastic. yes, we believe in all those possibilities, all those concepts. We believe in what we can't see. We believe in what we can't experience, and we try to understand. We try to experience as much as we possibly can. We try to see as much of God, as much of the universe, however you want to put that, as much of the divine as we can possibly get in order to understand the world. So we have to believe in a lot of possibilities and a lot of theories and a lot of, well, this could be true and, well, that could be true. And because of that, I think omnism, to some extent, moves into what might be referred to as a theoretical belief system. In other words, we don't necessarily say, oh, I believe in this God, and I would die for this God, and I would die for this God over this God. My God is bigger than your God, and he's better than your God, and my God could kick your God's butt, you know. Or my God is real, and your God isn't even real. Your God doesn't exist, only my God exists. You know, however you want to put that. We don't tend to be that way. The reason being that we believe that God is far beyond human concepts. So we use those human concepts. We use the monotheism and the polytheism and the pantheism and the animism and all of those things. We use those as perspectives. And the omnist, to me, takes all of those perspectives and tries to say, okay, if all this is true, what else is true? What more beyond this is true? If we can see God this way and this way and this way, what else? How else could we see God? For instance, back in the Old Testament, God tended to be an incredibly angry and jealous God, and he was always destroying people. I mean, this was just this was the God of the Old Testament, and then we get to the God of the New Testament, and we have this kind, loving God. And there are a lot of people that look at that as being a schizophrenic God. You know, this is not the same God. And then, as this friend of mine brought up as well, some people will also say, well, yeah, and also the gods he came from, you know, were more polytheistic, which some people believe it is true. You know, they believe that Yahweh and Asherah used to be part of a pantheon that the Hebrews sort of, you know, plucked out and said this is the God. Oh, and cut off Asherah, and now we just have this. That's not my point, but that's just one way you could look at it. So, how do you explain that kind of schizophrenia? To me, it's not terribly complicated. There's two ways to look at it. Number one, there's the sociological, which is simply that was when the Old Testament was written, which is, you know, loosely 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. We're not exactly sure, but you know, loosely. God tended to be someone to be appeased. I mean, in most cultures. And by the time Jesus came around, I mean, that was several thousand years later. Things had shifted. Things were moving, and people were starting to see God more as benevolent instead of as this authoritarian figure. But when you really think about it, we could say the exact same thing for our parents. You know, maybe when we were growing up, our parents were the ones who told us, don't do this and don't do that. Our parents were the ones who punished us. Our parents were the ones who were doing mean things to us. After all, we were young, we didn't fully understand. The more we grew up, we came to realize that they were just trying to teach us, that they were trying to keep us from hurting ourselves, all these sorts of things. And we start saying, oh yes, my parents actually both loved me, and they did those cruel, terrible things to help. Obviously, sometimes things that parents do are rather extreme, and they're downright abusive. But that's not really the point I'm headed at here. I'm just headed at our perspective, at the way that we see the same entity. Because when you think about it, we're all that way. We are all good and evil, and we have good intentions and bad intentions, and it all depends on how you see us. It all depends on the perspective of the people around us. And 10 different people who know me personally might very well describe me in completely different ways. One might think I'm the biggest jerk they ever met. One might think I was the nicest guy they ever met, depending on what day they met me and probably whether or not I'd had my coffee. But these perspectives really are important because I think, for instance, Christians who see God as a father, that works very well for people who like to look at their God as being a father. People who, let's say, didn't have a good relationship to their father might not do well with that. They might greatly prefer God be a mother. And of course, you have many cultures who saw God as a mother and not a father. Cultures who preferred to see God as a whole bunch of different gods. Now, I am not saying that none of that ever had any true validity. That's not at all what I'm saying. Maybe there were at one time these powerful beings who roamed the earth thousands of years ago, and we looked at them as gods. I have no idea. I'm not trying to say one way or the other. But when I say God, when I say the divine, I tend to personally be talking about something far beyond the polytheistic God or the monotheistic God or even the pantheistic God or panentheistic God, however, whatever. Because we are talking about a concept that is so huge that we, in our perspectives, reflect ourselves. If anything, I think that the Omnist is trying to see beyond those reflections. And I don't mean that the Omnist is in any way superior to any other believer. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying that is our focus. That is the only place where the Omnist may differ from certain other belief systems, is that their entire purpose is trying to figure out what we don't know. Trying to use all the information that we have garnered over thousands of years and trying to figure out more. What is the purpose of a universe that's like this? What is the purpose of a universe that's one of many universes? What if each and every one of us is simply the result of that version of us doing that? In other words, there's a version of us that has literally been everything. You know, there's a world where you're an evil person, there's a world where you're a good person, there's a world where you're a champion Olympian, and there's a world where you're a janitor. And this just happens to be the world that you are. That is one possibility. We really don't know. But as Omnists, we try to bring conclusions from that. So, in closing, when I say, how do Omnists believe? Or how do Omnists look at God? How do Omnists see all these things? If anything, the simplest thing I can say is simply that we're very elastic. We know that at any moment, everything could change. Aliens could land and they could give us more perspective. We could run into this race that's been around for millions of years, and their mythology and their religion has been evolving for all of that time. They have far more understandings of the way the universe works than we do, and therefore their view of the divine is significantly higher. And suddenly all the Omnists go, oh, okay, well, we've got to incorporate that now, which I think the Omnists could do. I think that some religions might either say, okay, this has either got to be a lie, whatever these aliens are saying has got to be a lie, or they just switch over to it. Okay, we'll just believe that now, that they know more than us, so we'll believe that now. The Omnist does take a different tack. It's just another thing to be incorporated. We feel there's always something outside it. There's always another layer to the onion that we'll have to peel off. And I'm fine with that. I'm fine with just slowly peeling one layer away at a time and hoping that eventually we get to something really cool. I'm the Urban Omnist. I hope some of that made sense.